Story 1: The Mysterious Encounter on the Tracks. Alright, here it goes. I don't usually open up about this, but here it is. I'm a graffiti artist, or as some might call it, a delinquent. Labels don't bother me much. In fact, I've grown to like them. At the end of the day, I know what I'm about. There's something about spray paint and concrete walls, the blank canvas of a railway car, or an abandoned building that speaks to me. The tagging community can be a little rough around the edges, if we're being honest. Other artists, they aren't exactly friends. There's no brotherhood, no camaraderie, and certainly no rules about respecting someone else's work. It's survival of the boldest, the fastest, and sometimes the most reckless. Because of this chaotic reality, I've learned to adopt a low-profile approach. I stick to quieter areas, places where no one else is likely to stumble upon my work. Old forgotten train lines, those are my go-to spots. Train cars rust in silence with nothing but dust and weeds as witnesses, and sometimes they're left abandoned, empty. The first time I came across one of these forgotten trains, the quietness struck me. A train yard with no one around is eerie, but also kind of perfect, like the ultimate blank canvas, just waiting for the first stroke of paint. My buddy Lucas sometimes joins me on these late-night excursions, even though he doesn't care much for tagging himself. There's a comfort in having him around, a reassurance that if something were to happen, at least I wouldn't be alone. He's not like my other friends, who don't seem to respect my time or interests. But Lucas, he's different. He gets it. We were out there on one of these abandoned tracks one night, puffing on a joint, heat rolled, just relaxing and talking. I don't smoke much myself, but when Lucas lights up, I'll join in for the vibe. This night the air was thick, hazy from the smoke, and the stillness had a calming quality to it. It wasn't too late yet, just past 10 p.m. The quiet just settling in. The odd thing was that none of the train cars had any tags. Usually there are at least a few, even on abandoned tracks. But this train was a blank slate. I felt a thrill. It's rare to find an untouched train. So I got to work. I tossed Lucas a can knowing he wouldn't use it, but liking that he could, if he wanted to, and started spraying. The sound of the can and the smell of paint were oddly grounding. 5 minutes in, I was in my groove, standing back to admire my first tag, when I heard a faint rustling behind us. I brushed it off, chalking it up to my imagination, and went to the next car, then the next. I was deep in concentration, and time slipped away. I'd finished a few pieces when I flung my empty cans back the way we came, savoring the satisfying clink as they bounced. I caught up with Lucas, who was on his second joint, entirely ignoring the can I'd handed him. He's a chill guy, more interested in the vibe than the art. I should have known better than to smoke 2 joints, but the night had a kind of charged calm. Then, just as we were talking, a metallic clang split the quiet. My stomach dropped, we froze. Straining to listen, the sound seemed to echo, each clang bouncing off the train cars and dissolving into the silence. I couldn't tell if it was coming from inside the train or from somewhere nearby. My heart was pounding so loudly, I could barely hear anything else. Then came another noise, closer. This time the unmistakable sound of metal hitting metal. I whipped out my phone to record, fumbling in my pocket, my hands shaking slightly as I pressed record. I whispered, "Bro. What the hell was that?" The clang sounded again, sharper this time, followed by an ominous wrestling. We both froze, holding our breaths as the night closed in around us. Then out of nowhere a paint can flew past us, hitting the ground with a deafening clatter. But adrenaline flooded my system as I tried to process what had just happened. The darkness in front of us seemed to shift, and the figure emerged, shouting at us to get lost. I didn't need to hear it twice. Lucas and I bolted, running down the tracks as fast as we could. Somewhere behind us, another loud crash echoed, followed by a gunshot. Lucas stumbled, almost falling, and I yanked him back up, my heart racing. My hand slipped off the record button as we ran, and the video cut out. We didn't stop until we reached the road, panting, hands shaking. We made it back to the car and sat in silence, the adrenaline slowly fading as reality set in. I couldn't call the police. I was breaking the law after all. But I knew I couldn't just leave it at that. Weeks later, I went back. This time in daylight, the train was still there, but my tags had been covered with splotches of red paint. In one of the cars, I found a chair in the center, ropes scattered around it, and the overwhelming smell of bleach. It was as if someone had tried to erase everything, not just my tags, but the entire presence of anyone who'd been there. I've told this story 100 times, but no one has been able to explain what happened that night. Some nights when it's dark and quiet, I can still hear that clang echoing through the silence. Story to the train tunnel horror. It was the start of summer, and I'd just gotten back to my old hometown. Usually, I avoid coming back here, preferring to stay in my college town or go somewhere far away like Europe. But this year's circumstances had forced me back. I only had a week before I'd be off to Germany, and I wasn't in the mood to meet up with old friends. So I passed the time alone, hiking, watching movies, or driving aimlessly through familiar streets. On my last day, the boredom started to set in. I wanted something different, something exciting. My friends and I used to hop trains back in the day, something we'd long since outgrown. But the nostalgia hit hard, and I thought, why not? There was a stretch of tracks I remembered, nestled between trees and leading into a tunnel that crossed a bridge over the river. We used to ride the trains across that bridge, but with no friends in tow. I settled on a simpler plan. I'd hop on a train, ride it through the tunnel, and get off on the other side, taking the long walk back to my car. I parked my car a ways off and walked to the tracks, waiting for a train to pass. After a few minutes, I felt the rails start to hum underfoot. Unducked out of sight, freight trains are massive and intimidating up close, the sound and size almost overwhelming. When a few cars had passed, I sprinted alongside, grabbing hold of a ladder and pulling myself up. It was exhilarating, a mix of fear and thrill that reminded me of old times. As the train neared the tunnel, I saw a flash of light from inside. I assumed it was a spark or something. Nothing too unusual, but the light seemed odd, like it was coming from something moving inside the tunnel. I ignored it though, focusing on the darkness ahead. Just as the train entered the tunnel, something grabbed my leg from below. My heart lurched, and I almost lost my grip, my mind racing. I kicked out blindly, hitting nothing but air, and scrambled up the ladder out of reach. The train was picking up speed, and I clung to the metal. My knuckles white, the world narrowing to the space in front of me. But before I could catch my breath, another hand slapped against my leg. I was screaming now, kicking wildly. I could barely see anything, just the dark walls rushing past. My thoughts were a blur. Were there people in the tunnel? How could that even be possible? As the train exited the tunnel, I jumped off, landing on unsteady legs. The train rumbled on, disappearing over the bridge. I was alone in a small clearing. The tunnel behind me. A dark mouth leading back to my car. The realization hit me like a punch. I'd have to go back through the tunnel. The thought made my skin crawl. But I couldn't leave my car behind. I waited for what felt like hours before I worked up the courage to go back. I picked up a rock as if that would somehow protect me, and walked into the darkness. Halfway through, I heard a faint clicking sound. Almost human, but not quite. My hand was shaking, and I called out, bluffing that I had a gun. Silence then from further down. The figure emerged, silhouetted by another flash of light. I sprinted, not stopping until I burst out the other side. When I looked back, I saw them standing there watching. That screech still haunts my nightmares. A reminder of that day I dared to go back. Story 3: The Strange Night at High Street Station. I've been an MTA worker for years now, and the city's subway system is no stranger to strange events. You get used to it in a way. Missing persons, weird sounds, an unexpected light flashing down a tunnel. But that night at High Street Station was something else. It was a Tuesday in the middle of winter, past midnight, and I'd taken a night shift as a favor to a coworker. I thought I knew what to expect. Quiet tunnels, a few late-night passengers, and the kind of solitude only the underground could offer. But as soon as I arrived, there was an uneasy stillness in the air. I went about my usual tasks, checking the platform, ensuring the tracks were clear, and minding the signals. There weren't many passengers at this hour, just the occasional commuter, or someone making their way home. But that night, as I stood on the edge of the platform, I saw a figure at the far end, hunched over. In the dim light, I couldn't make out any details, but something about the way they stood motionless, almost frozen, sent a chill down my spine. I called out, "Station's closing soon. Last train's in 10, no response." The figure didn't move, just stood there like a statue. I tried again, louder this time, my voice echoing off the tile walls, but still nothing. Unease began to gnaw at me, so I made my way down the platform, one cautious step at a time. As I got closer, I could see it was a man, though his face was hidden under a tattered hood, his clothes dark and ragged. He was staring at the tracks, completely still. "Sir, the last train's coming. You need to step back from the edge," I said, hoping he'd listen. But he didn't react. His silence was unnerving. There was something off about his stance, something unnatural, like he was braced for something, waiting. I was just about to reach for my radio, when, out of nowhere, he turned his head slightly, and I caught a glimpse of his face. In the flickering fluorescent light, his skin was pale to pale, and his eyes were wide, almost unblinking. But the worst part, there was a strange, almost unnatural grin plastered across his face, like he knew something I didn't. It made my stomach twist. The radio crackled to life just then. breaking the silence. Last train. Arriving platform to the voice said, and the rumble of the approaching train filled the station. I turned for a split second, instinctively glancing down the track, and when I looked back, the man was gone. Just like that, I hadn't heard him move. Hadn't seen him jump onto the tracks or walk away. He had simply vanished. The train pulled in, its brakes hissing, and the few passengers who were left got on. I scanned the platform, heart racing, expecting to see him lurking in the shadows. But there was no sign of him. I told myself it was late, that maybe he'd just slipped away while I was distracted. But something in my gut told me otherwise. I couldn't shake the feeling. So after the train pulled out, I decided to search the station. I walked down the dimly lit corridors, checking every nook and cranny. When I got to the entrance of an old maintenance tunnel, a place I'd never had reason to go, I felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of dread. The air was thick, stale, as if it hadn't been disturbed in years. I hesitated, but curiosity got the better of me. I shone my flashlight down the tunnel, revealing graffiti, unpeeling paint. It was empty, or so I thought, until I caught a faint whisper. It sounded like my name echoing faintly, and my blood ran cold. I told myself it was just the wind, but I knew better. The whisper grew louder, more insistent, and I felt something shift in the darkness, like a presence moving closer. I backed away, stumbling, my heart pounding in my chest. Just as I turned to leave, I saw a figure at the far end of the tunnel, barely visible in the shadows. It was him, the same man from the platform, standing perfectly still, his face hidden but his eyes shining in the darkness. And that grin, it was even wider, now, impossibly wide. I bolted back to the platform, not daring to look back. When I finally reached the surface, I found the station eerily empty, and the street outside was silent, the city's usual hum strangely muted. I reported what I'd seen to my supervisor, but he just left it off, chalking it up to fatigue or nerves. But I know what I saw, and since that night, I've heard stories, whispers from other workers, about the phantom of High Street Station, a man who appears late at night, only to disappear without a trace. Some say he's the ghost of a commuter who met a tragic end on those tracks. Others claim he's something older, a spirit tied to the city's dark history, lingering in the tunnels, waiting. I don't take the night shift anymore, and I don't go near High Street if I can help it. But every so often late at night, I think I can still hear that whisper, calling my name from somewhere deep below the city.